Well, Jay, one of the things I at least didn't anticipate when we started doing the podcast 5 years ago was that how many opportunities we would have to actually speak with the people that we report on. And we have certainly talked about David Israelite as well as the NMPA many, many, many times over the last 300 plus episodes. And we finally got a chance to sit down and talk with David, and what a treat it was.
Yeah, such a great conversation. And for those that don't know, the NMPA is the National Music Publishers Association, and David is the president and CEO, but he's much more. He's such an advocate for songwriters and for musicians in general, and we just had such a great conversation with him. And, you know, one of the things that impressed me about him is he's got this history. He's worked for the U.S. government, worked for the Department of Justice, and he's also a guitar player that played in bands. And I thought that was really great. But as you said, sometimes we get to talk to the people who are actually making the news, and it was just such a pleasure. So now, without further ado, here's David Israelite. Let it roll.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! Your morning coffee is on the air. On the air. On the air. On the air. On the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Let's kick this off, David, and I'd like to sort of start with the basics for those with no prior knowledge, because our business is complex by design. And when you look at, the publishing side and the master side, when you try to explain that to your parents, their eyes kind of gloss over a little bit. And I would imagine in your role, you have to explain some of these complex things and simplify them. So let's talk about the differences between publishing and master royalties and some of the main ways songwriters get paid, because, some are set by judges and, like on the master side, it's a free market.
Sure. So it's a very complicated industry, and for most fans of music, they never think about these issues. But what you need to understand is that the music industry really is two different industries. There is a bright line that divides two fundamental roles in music. One is the songwriter, someone who sits down and writes the words and the melodies of a song. That song itself has a copyright, which is really a property interest. It's protected by law. And songwriters create copyrights with their songs, and they're represented by music publishers. There are a lot of words that people throw around, publishing, the composition, but they basically mean the same thing, which is the song itself. When an artist takes that song and makes a recording of the song, that recording has a different copyright. And that artist is generally represented by a record label. And again, lots of terms are thrown around like master rights or recording rights. They all mean the same thing. It's the copyright in the recording of the song. To get people to try to think about this, I like to use two different examples. Think about the song I Will Always Love You, written by Dolly Parton, but the most famous version of it recorded by Whitney Houston. The song itself, owned by Dolly Parton, the songwriter, the version that Whitney Houston recorded has a different copyright that Whitney Houston and her record label control. That is a very different situation than, say, take a Taylor Swift song, where she's both the songwriter and the artist that does it. But even in that case, Taylor Swift lives in two different worlds. she has songwriter rights, and she has artist rights. And those are different things. Where it gets really interesting is that those two different copyrights have been regulated by the government in completely different ways. And so the business model of how a songwriter makes money or how an artist makes money is completely different, and the laws and regulations that apply to them are completely different. And so that's when we start to get into a lot of interesting issues about how it works for songwriters and how it works for artists. But the most important thing to remember, two different copyrights representing two different interests, even when the same person is playing both roles.
David, we should probably also start with talk a little bit about how you got in from where you came before you came to this organization, and then also a little bit about just your interest in music as a young person and kind of how it all kind of came together working where you are now.
Like most people that work in the music industry, we started as wanting to be musicians ourselves. And so I was like many people where I played guitar, I was in some bands and had dreams and aspirations of becoming a rock star. And that was not to be, and I knew that pretty early. I was a very average guitar player. My bands were not going anywhere. And so I gave up that dream and I followed my career path, which was in law and politics and government. And I had a lot of jobs in those fields. And I ended up at the Justice Department, where I was working for the Attorney General of the United States. And this was during the period of Napster, when many people were stealing music and the music industry was really hurting. And I had a very close friend who worked for record labels, running the trade association that represents them called the RIAA. And I was watching what was happening through his eyes in terms of how artists and songwriters were struggling because so many consumers who used to buy music were now stealing music. And so I came up with an idea to start a task force at the Justice Department to focus on intellectual property. And the Attorney General was kind enough to create this task force and let me chair this task force. And so for a couple of years, I really focused on these issues while I was working for the US government. And right when I was getting ready to leave government, my trade association, NMPA, which represents all the music publishers and their songwriter partners, they were headhunting for a new CEO, and it just turned out to be the perfect opportunity for someone who loved music, wished he could have been a musician himself, but instead I tried to take the skills that I had from being an attorney and working in government. And what a trade association really does is marry a particular industry with everything to do with government. And so I was very well prepared to represent the government and policy and political side. I had to learn a lot about the music business. And I've been doing that for 20 years, and I'm still learning about the music business.
As are we. You know, one of the hottest topics today is AI, training on large data sets of somebody's intellectual property. And it's evolving pretty quickly, and we're all trying to keep up. What's the NMPA's current posture, on consent, attribution, and ultimately compensation for companies that are hopefully licensing intellectual property and then training these data sets?
It's a huge issue. In fact, it dominates most discussions in the music business right now are issues involving AI. And so it might help to break it down into some subparts so that people can think about these issues maybe a little more specifically than just kind of this broad question of what does AI mean for music. I'll answer that top question. Overall, I am optimistic that AI will provide more opportunities than dangers for music. But I think it's going to be a really complicated path, and I think there are going to be a lot of ups and downs. And I'll get into some of that. When I think about AI, I kind of think about it in three different buckets because of how we engage with this topic. The first bucket is a legal question. What can these companies do? What rights do we have? Are they being violated? There are a lot of lawsuits that are currently pending. I suspect it's going to be a very long time before we know the answers to what these AI models can do legally or what they've been doing that might be illegal. Generally, the questions surround this question of what's called fair use. Can they take all of the music to train their model without our permission, without a license, without compensation? And so those lawsuits are going to play out. We probably will have varied results that end up getting consolidated in higher courts. And I'm not expecting clear answers on the legal question for a very long time. The second basket of issues have to do with the government and policy, which is what will the government do to protect creators in an AI world? And so there's lots of legislation that is being proposed that would affect this, or different types of regulations that might impact it, both on a state level and a federal level. And again, on that question, I think it's going to be a very long time for that to play out. I think it's going to be a mixed bag of what we can expect from the government to help us in these questions. Some of the government's role will depend on the answer to the first question of what the law currently is and whether or not there need to be changes in the law. But one of the things that I worry about is that if governments view the development of AI as having national security implications or economic security implications, then anything that slows down the development in this kind of race among countries is going to be a speed bump that they're going to want to flatten. And copyright might be seen as a speed bump in development of AI models. And so I think we have to be very concerned that despite our legitimate property interests in protecting creators' rights, that if governments are more concerned about winning an AI arms race, then we're going to lose in that equation. So again, legal, long time uncertain. Policy and government, long time uncertain. It sounds very pessimistic. The third category has to do with business, commercial applications, and that's where I'm the most optimistic. Because what I believe is that AI companies are going to come around to the point of view that they want to partner with the music industry, not just try to take without permission or consent or compensation and do what they can get away with. I've used an analogy in the past that I think is really instructive, which is how YouTube developed. When YouTube first came on the scene, YouTube didn't think it had to pay songwriters. They thought that they were this platform where some people could upload copyrighted material, other people could go listen and watch copyrighted material, and that if you just told them to take it down, they had to take it down, but they didn't have to pay you. And we spent 4 years litigating against YouTube on this question. And ultimately, it's not because we won the lawsuit. It's because YouTube decided they wanted to do more than just be this platform where people could post and watch. They wanted to actually do things with music. And that led to negotiated settlements, business relationships. And while people can debate whether they pay enough, and that is a debate, it is the largest paying company to songwriters on the planet today. Starting from a point of view, they didn't have to pay at all. So I think there are a lot of analogies from that experience, which again took many years to get through, to what we're dealing with AI. There's one other angle of this that I think is really important for songwriters, which is, let's assume we get to a world where AI companies are licensing and are paying for the content. You then get to the question of how that money is divided. It's always a question in the music industry. I am very, very concerned that songwriters and music publishers get their fair share of any revenue that is generated from AI models. And with AI models, the song itself is more important than the recordings of the song to train models. I've talked to the leading AI experts about this, and they all admit when they're building a model, when they are scraping music to educate their language models, the song itself is by far the more important input. And so I've been very encouraged to see that some of the early business deals that have been done have basically protected the place of songwriters and publishers. And so, for example, Cobalt recently did a licensing deal with an AI company where they secured the guarantee that the song will always get as much money as the recording in those deals. Now, why would I be worried about that? I'm worried about that because for very large companies that have both record label interest and publishing interests, there is sometimes an incentive to have the money be classified as recorded music interest. And that's just because of a very natural business inclination that recorded music revenue is more profitable for a company than publishing revenue. And so you've seen some of the models in other fields develop where how's the money split? Well, for things like synchronization, where a movie or a TV show wants to put a song in a movie, that money's split 50-50. For other models like Spotify, Apple, Amazon, you have a split that's more like 4-1 in terms of recorded music to publishing. And so when an AI model finally gets around to licensing and paying, is it going to look more like synchronization? Is it going to look more like a Spotify model? And so far, at least the early developments suggest that we are going to be able to protect the role of the songwriter. And one final thing that you asked about in your question, I believe strongly that licensing needs to be voluntary and consensual. It should not be a compulsory license where you have to opt out, or whether the government tells you that you must license and that the government will set rates. I think it needs to be a free market, where if they want to use music, they can go negotiate deals in a free market. That is the best way to protect the rights of songwriters in this process.
Let's talk about another juggernaut, TikTok. TikTok's licensing standoffs have highlighted short-form video platforms' outsized influence. What does a sustainable TikTok-style deal look like to you in 2025, and how do you value music when it drives creation rather than consumption minutes?
It's a great question, and I'm glad you asked about it because I've been particularly focused on models like TikTok, but it's a broader question than just that one company. So for songwriters and music publishers, as you both know, a good deal of what we do is regulated by law or regulation, where we don't have a choice. We have to license, and the prices are set by the government. In fact, about 70% of what a songwriter makes, the government sets the price, either through a compulsory license in the law for things that are called mechanical reproductions, or through consent decrees that govern the two largest performance rights organizations, ASCAP and BMI, where federal judges set the price, and you can't say no. That's 70% of our business. The fastest growing part of our business, though, is that 30% that's not regulated, that has to do with video. So things like mass synchronization models, such as YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, things like that. You would think that we're in a great position when we're in a free market for things like TikTok, because that's going to more accurately reflect the value of the songs in the model when you can say no. But we have a unique problem in the music industry. And that is, if you try to say no because the price isn't fair, we have a problem in that our own community cannibalizes itself because of why they're on the platform. So let me explain. If you are an artist that records music and your music is on TikTok, you are not primarily concerned about making money on TikTok. TikTok is a vehicle where you are connecting with your fans, you are promoting your brand so that you can go sell concert tickets or merchandise, and that's how you're going to make your money. However, if you are a songwriter and you are on TikTok, that is your business. You are not promoting yourself for anything else that will produce revenue for you. You don't sell concert tickets or merchandise. And so if the price that a TikTok pays is unfair, and songwriters in the free market want to say, no, you cannot have our license, we end up in a situation where recording artists get very upset that they are pulled off of a platform like a TikTok. And we fight with each other. And TikTok gets to sit back and just wait it out until we don't have the stomach or the spine to continue the fight because our own people are criticizing us. Now compare that to what goes on in film and television. When the screenwriters who are unionized decide to go on strike, the famous artists, or the actors, that they write for, they're impacted the same way that an artist is on TikTok. Their movie doesn't come out. Their TV show goes dark. But you don't see famous Hollywood actors criticizing the screenwriters for going on strike. They stand behind them. They actually support their fellow creators in the screenwriters. That doesn't happen in the music industry. And so I have started what I hope to be a campaign to start to really put attention on this point and convince recording artists and their labels and their managers that they should be standing with songwriters if the songwriters decide they're not getting paid fairly. Because if you don't have a healthy songwriting business, then these artists are not going to have good songs to record. And so when it comes to TikTok, you've seen some companies actually try to negotiate by playing hardball and saying, we're going to pull the music. That has not worked well because of this dynamic in the music industry. That needs to change. It is very important to these models like TikTok, the music is. It's worth a great deal more than we're getting paid from these models. But one of the reasons why we're not seeing the proper pricing in the marketplace is because of this dynamic of, can you actually withhold the product if you don't like the price? So we need to focus on that point. And I hope going forward that when people that represent songwriters, whether those be publishers or performance rights organizations, if they don't think the price is fair and they deny the songs to the platform in the one area of the business where they can do that, synchronization, then the industry needs to stand together behind those songwriters. Because I think that right now, the value proposition from these platforms like TikTok or a YouTube or a Facebook, it's not proper. We deserve more.
I want to talk to you a little bit, David, about the Mechanical Licensing Collective. Where we're at today with things like unmatched royalties and basic, metadata accuracy and audits of DSPs. What should the industry be doing to hold the MLC in the next phase?
Sure. So first of all, for people that aren't familiar with the MLC, this is an organization that was created from a law that was passed in 2018, called the Music Modernization Act. And it was in part designed to help fix a problem in the music industry. I mentioned earlier this idea that songwriters live under this compulsory license in the law. What that means, for those that don't know, is that for the main way that people access music, streaming services like Spotify, Apple, or Amazon, we've talked about the two different copyrights. Well, when Spotify, Apple, or Amazon want to put a recording into their library so that their customers can access it, they have to go negotiate that deal with record labels in a free market. The record labels can say no, and they can agree on the terms. But for the songwriters don't have a choice. It's regulated by a law. It's a very old law that's been around since 1909, when Congress thought that music publishers had a monopoly on player piano rolls, those things that you would stick in a piano and they would play themselves. And so back in 1909, Congress passed a law that said, songwriters, publishers, you must license your copyright, and we, the government, will set the price. And they set the price back then at 2 cents per copy. That law today means that when you subscribe to Spotify, Apple, or Amazon, what the songwriter gets paid is regulated by law, and the songwriter cannot say no if they don't like the price. They're forced to do it. However, one of the problems with that law is that the digital companies were having a very hard time actually using the law that was the compulsory license. And so if you go back to the old days of where record labels made records, they would license song by song on a record with the music publisher. And even though the music publisher couldn't say no, it was all kind of done within the same family of the music industry. And on a 10, 12, 15 track record, you would work it out over time about making sure that the licenses were done properly. But if you were Spotify, Apple, or Amazon, and you wanted to open up a store with 40, 50, 80 million recordings, and you were not part of the process of making those recordings, you oftentimes didn't know exactly where to go to get the rights that we had to give them. There was a process for it, and that process was broken. And because of that, there was a lot of money that was unmatched. So Spotify would collect money, they would try to match it with who the songwriters were, and they would fail a good chunk of the time, say around 30% of the time, and that money would sit at Spotify. Well, this law created a new body called the MLC, or the Mechanical Licensing Collective, that now takes all of the money from Spotify, Apple, Amazon, and others who do that type of business, and they're the ones that try to match it and get the money out to the right people. The first thing to understand is that the match rates have gone up significantly. We are now looking at a match rate of over 91%.
Wow.
From a match rate that used to be in the low 70s. So we are already succeeding at doing a better job of matching. However, any unmatched money is unacceptable. We should be trying to match 100%. And so you start to get down to what is the real nut of the problem, which is, why is this so hard? And it is a problem that everyone in the process shares some blame. I think for people that are more creative, who are your listeners as opposed to more business oriented, they know this, that when you go to make music, the last thing that you're worried about are the legal technicalities of who owns what split of a song. You know, the copyright that songwriters create is owned in fractions. Everyone involved has a piece of 100% pie. And until that is all agreed upon, you can't pay out any money. But what too often happens is the people who create the music go and do the creative process, the music becomes available, money is generated, and now we have to go backward and figure out who owns what. And so it's a huge problem. There's also a problem in that it has become so easy to make music and distribute music that what you have is an enormous industry of what we call the long tail, basically independent artists making their own music, uploading it through a third-party provider, and they don't even necessarily know what publishing is. They may own the publishing and not know to claim that they own the song that they wrote but now have recorded and put up. So we're dealing with problems that go back for a very long time, and no one seems to have the will to do what's really necessary. If you want to solve this problem, there's a simple solution. You can't release a recording until you have cleared all the publishing rights. If that were the rule, we wouldn't have the problem. Everyone would be incentivized to answer the question because no one would get to put the music out, make money, have their fans listen to it until you've answered that question. But for some reason, the music industry seems unwilling to do that. So instead, we give the MLC billions of lines of data, billions of dollars, and tell them figure it out. And they're doing a great job at it. 91+% matched. They're also operating at the lowest overhead cost of any collecting society in the world. They're currently operating at under 3% of the cost, which means if they're collecting $100, it's taking them less than $3 to do their job. And what's great for songwriters and music publishers is that we don't pay that $3. The Spotifys and Apples and the Amazons of the world have to pay that $3. And again, it's the only collecting society in the world where the people who are creating the music aren't the ones paying for the administration. And so I think it's been a huge success, but I would like to see us match 100% of the money. That's the goal. To do that, you need everybody to cooperate, which means that while you're in the studio making the music, you've got to know the splits. If you are uploading your own music, you've got to include the publishing splits. Because if you don't, you are giving the MLC what is an unsolvable problem. There's no answer to the question. And so the law has decided what to do. You basically try to find the owner for 3 years. You publicize what you can't match. And so there is a public database. It's the only one in the world where you can go look at the MLC and say, here's the money we couldn't match, and here's the name of the sound recording that we couldn't match. And you can claim if any of it's yours. But after 3 years, if no one's claimed it, after it's been publicly disclosed, then what the law decided is that the MLC should distribute that money using a formula that Congress decided was the best possible formula when you can't find the owner. And that is a better solution than the money staying at a Spotify or Apple or Amazon. The money's going to creatives because what you're basically doing is saying, okay, if we couldn't match $1 from Spotify, we're going to look at the $90 that we did match and we're going to lay that dollar over the same distribution formula and spread it out. Doesn't mean it's going to the exact right people, but it's going to songwriters, which is better than that dollar staying at Spotify. So I think the MLC has been an unquestionable success. It is the best of what its kind is in the world. It has all these incredible advantages that you don't find in other places, such as you can audit it. You can't audit other collecting societies. It has a public database. No other collecting society just gives you their copy of their database. It is paid for 100% by the people that use it, not by the people whose money it is. It's the only one in the world like that. And as I just said, it's matching at a higher rate than anyone that's done it before. And for collecting societies, we often don't know what their match rate is. When money goes to a PRO, for example, they never identify unmatched money. What they do is they sample and they model it and they send all the money out minus their overhead or commission or profit. And you never know if the money was properly matched or not. With mechanicals in the MLC, we identify the unmatched, we publicize it publicly. We give a 3-year window to get it right before it gets distributed. So I think the MLC gets an A+ for what it's been doing since its inception.
Nice. Of course, in the music publishing world, we're talking about a business that goes back to the 19th century, basically, which has an enormous amount of challenges as it moves forward. If you were to snap your finger and just change a couple of things to kind of update everything, what would it be? What would you do to maybe just kind of, this would be like you just mentioned one a minute ago, but what would you do in this juggernaut of publishing to maybe kind of bring it up and improve it and make it more resilient?
I only wish I had that power, but if I did, the first thing I would do is I would make sure that all of songwriters get to negotiate a fair price for their songs. No more government regulation. It is preposterous that you have a 1909 law that regulated player pianos and a 1941 consent decree that was meant to protect the fledgling broadcast industry against the giants of ASCAP and BMI, that has led to a situation where today 70% of our prices are set by the government and not in a free market. That would be the most important thing to do. The second thing then I would do is that once you are in that free market and get to negotiate prices, I would make sure that if you don't give your consent or permission, you cannot use the music. And too often we get caught in situations where we have to use notice and takedowns and send tens and tens of millions of notices to try to remove music that just gets reposted. Or we have a situation where, like with TikTok, you pull the music and all of a sudden public pressure pushes you to put it back on. I would create a true market, which is that the songs get paid what they're worth. Only then would I turn to the data issues, because while I feel like they're very important, they are small economically compared to these other issues. And I also think that there is some degree of responsibility that songwriters and music publishers have to take to manage their own copyrights. We grew up in an industry where we kind of said, someone else will worry about that for us. You'll collect our mechanicals and you figure out it's mine and give it to me. You'll collect my public performance and you figure out if it's mine and give it to me. Or for synchronization, I'm only licensing one song for one purpose. There was no YouTube or TikTok where mass synchronization happened. So songwriters and publishers have to manage their businesses. And that means go check the MLC database. Make sure it's accurate. Register your copyrights. Take care of your splits with your co-writers. These are things that you need to do for yourselves. And so I don't know that what I would change if I were the music god, but I would just give that as advice to all songwriters and publishers that there is some degree of responsibility about collecting the money that you're owed. And that if we want to be in a world that is more free market, we have to do more to make sure it's licensed and collected properly.
David, this has been a fantastic conversation. We really appreciate you taking the time. As we wind down, I want to ask you one last question. It's really about my perception, and Mike and I cover a lot of these issues every week and have for so many years. It feels like we're making progress. It may be slow progress, but I feel like whether it's with the Copyright Royalty Board or the work that you're doing with TikTok or working on AI, I feel like it's in the forefront of people's minds where it was sort of hidden before. I want to ask you two quick questions. Do you feel like we're making progress, number one, and are you optimistic?
So on the question of are we making progress, I think it's a complicated answer because I think that two things can be true at the same time. The first thing is that the industry is very healthy. We have now experienced double-digit growth every year for about a decade. We have come out of that kind of period of the theft model being the primary way that people got their music to a model that is very complicated in terms of the number of people that pay songwriters and how the licenses happen. But overall, there is growth in music publishing and songwriting, significant growth. At the same time that that is true, many songwriters are struggling. You would think that when the industry is flourishing, that all songwriters who are commercially relevant and successful would also be flourishing. And the reason why that's not necessarily true is because the business has changed. We used to be a business that sold albums. And what that meant is that if you were a songwriter on a successful album, all of the songwriters got the benefit of that album doing well. We've moved to a world where we basically are dealing with only hits and singles. And we are dealing with a world where there is such a long tail of more people making something from songwriting that you have the middle class kind of being squeezed. You have the very successful songwriters doing very well. You have more songwriters making something than at any point in history. But if you are just kind of a middle class, work hard, have some commercial success songwriter, you're not seeing the benefits in the same way that you used to when the industry was more based on selling albums. And so I feel like industry-wide, lots of progress. Individual songwriters, lots of challenges for many of them. Many of them are having to find other ways to promote what they're doing. And so you'll see a lot of, writers start writing for film or TV or for shorts or things like that to try to supplement their own income, or there's constant pressure to get hits. And the other thing that's true is that streamers are taking so much money out of the system that even though there's growth in the system, you've got another mouth to feed, which is this now technology third party, and it's out of whack. So just to give you an example, take a typical dollar from Spotify. Record labels and artists are taking roughly 50 to 55 cents of that dollar. Songwriters are getting about a dime of that dollar, 10 to 15 cents of that dollar. Spotify's keeping the rest. Spotify is keeping 3 times what they pay the songwriters. And when you think about it, Spotify is really a glorified Grubhub. They're delivering something that someone else made. And yet they're getting paid 3 times what the person who made the product is getting paid. Now, I don't want to minimize the role of a delivery system like a Spotify because it's very important to reach consumers, but it's not worth 3 times the song itself. So I think it's a mixed answer about progress. The industry is making a great deal of progress, but there's so much more work to do. And the other thing that's true, we are experiencing significant growth, and at the same time, songs are not getting paid nearly what they're worth, right? What a song is worth is what someone is willing to pay for it in a marketplace. And the songs are providing so much value to other people that are not paying for its fair worth. Just look at the value of TikTok. How important was music to TikTok? And yet, songwriters are not necessarily experiencing that. We talk about Spotify, whether they're profitable or not. Forget their annual profitability. How much wealth was created through their stock that is not being shared by songwriters? So business is doing well, but so many challenges, especially for individual songwriters.
David, we've wanted to talk to you for a long time, and we talk about you and your work quite a bit here, and you did not disappoint. We really appreciate your time, and I hope we can talk again.
For sure.
Well, let me just also say, Jay and Mike, I so appreciate what you do. These are complicated issues, and your listeners get so educated by listening to your program that you are doing a tremendous service for the entire industry, for spending the time that you do to break down these issues, explain them, spread the word. And I just want to tell you I'm a fan and that I really appreciate what you do.
Thank you so much.
Very kind of you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.